On October 27th, U-557 sailed into Lorient Harbour. A gay crowd awaited us. This time, however, the girls from the établissements were not among the well-wishers. As we learned later, the naval complex had been fenced off against unauthorized personnel. But after our usual welcome-home dinner and a thorough washing, a good portion of our men found their French girls holding open house in the downtown bordellos. Most of the men were not seen on the base before reveille the next morning. On the afternoon of November 3rd, the crew again assembled in the large square of the prefecture. Admiral Dönitz had come from his command post to greet us. Again he dispensed medals with a lavish hand. I watched proudly, unaware that these were my last minutes as a member of the crew of U-557. After the affair, Paulson broke the news that I was transferred to the first U-boat flotilla in Brest, the largest port on the coast of Brittany. It was a hard blow. Only reluctantly did I accept the order that separated me from my many friends, and from the boat on which I had found my cause. The wonderful camaraderie that had united enlisted men and officers was suddenly for me a thing of the past. I no longer belonged. As I said goodbye to captain and crew, I saw traces of moisture in several eyes. That day was the last time that I shook the hands of those men, those dear comrades who had escaped death with me so often. U-557 left Lorient on November 19th for the Mediterranean. She succeeded in breaking through the Strait of Gibraltar, where the British had set up a tight blockade, and crowned her career with the sinking of the British cruiser Galatea near Alexandria. But U-557 met her fate on December 16th in the ironic form of an Italian destroyer, the Orione, a ship of a friendly nation, which accidentally rammed her in the Sea of Crete. U-557 went to the bottom, carrying her whole crew down into eternal entombment. On November 5th, I was chauffeured by a Russian immigrant driver across the sun-drenched landscape of Brittany. As our Citroën chased down the highway, the needle of the speedometer often crept over the 120-kilometre mark. Speed and sun and the beautiful countryside soon changed my mood. It was exhilarating to come back from the inferno at sea and find myself flying across a foreign world full of marvels. Nonetheless, I was relieved to step out of the car when it careened to a stop at the gate of the first U-boat flotilla in Brest. Before me, overlooking the bay, lay a sprawling granite complex. Some of the buildings were not yet completed. The stately structures had been built to house the French Naval Academy, but our conquest of France had put a halt to the college program. Instead of French enthusiasts, German U-boat aces had moved into the quarters. I reported briskly to the adjutant of the flotilla. He told me that I would soon have to attend U-boat school. The winter term was about to begin. This was disappointing news. However, I had no objection to a few days of idleness after 6 months of extraordinary activity. I established myself in a room with a breathtaking view of the harbour and Crozon Peninsula. Then I went out to explore the town. Brest, I had been warned, was a hotbed of espionage and sabotage. Occasionally, too, members of the French resistance abducted or murdered our men. But the city was busy and peaceful. Its cafes, bistros and shops were gay and thriving, and the presence of countless Germans in uniform offered added reassurance. It was a sunny November day, the scent of fall was in the air, and I resolved to enjoy myself to the fullest. After a delicious seafood dinner, I walked through the picturesque streets, stopped at this cafe or that, and browsed through every bookstore I passed. In one of these shops I saw Yvonne. She worked there. Her blonde hair and blue eyes attracted me at once. I asked her for some books that she could not possibly have, and managed to engage her in a conversation that ended with a dinner date for the following evening. The next day, fearing that sudden transfer orders would spoil my plans, I left the base early and spent another pleasant afternoon wandering through Brest. Well before the time to meet Yvonne, I was waiting impatiently for her in a bistro across from the city hall. She was graceful, fragile, and afraid. Her only contact with a German, she said, had been an occasional remark over the counter on the subject of books. But soon she found herself in an unpatriotic tête-à-tête with one of the intruders in the obscure light of an exclusive restaurant. Dinner was excellent. Dessert was sweetened by her promise to see me again. The evening ended, much too soon, and to my great disappointment at the fence surrounding her house on the other side of town. I met Yvonne again the following evening, not during daylight, for she did not wish to be seen in public with me. At her gate after sunset, under the protection of the growing darkness, she was not so afraid anymore. From then on, I was a regular guest at Yvonne's home. Whenever I went to her, I secured my gun at my belt, determined to meet Yvonne and not my executioner, a member of the Maquis, in a lonely alley of Brest. Whenever I slipped out of Yvonne's home, it was sunrise, never before, for I wanted a clear view of anyone who might be following me through the streets of Brest. I never asked Yvonne more than I needed to know. She said that she loved me, and that was all I wished to hear. In turn, I promised her everything for the love she so graciously spent on me. I enjoyed these days of sunshine and autumn flowers, but after 2 weeks came the task of telling Yvonne about my new command. We vowed to see each other again as soon as I would return. I hoped to be back in the spring, when the cherry blossoms would be in bloom. The last I saw of her was her bright scarf disappearing in the night as my train pulled out of the station. Arriving at the Gare de Montparnasse, I decided impulsively to stay in Paris that day and take the evening train to Germany. I rushed through the Louvre, walked down the Champs-Élysées, stood at the Place de l'Étoile, surveyed the city from the top of the Eiffel Tower, and sat in the Café de la Paix, watching a brilliant new world go by. When the church bells rang out the day, I had barely sampled the pearl of all cities. Next morning it was cool and misty as my train crossed the Rhine. But the sun had burned off the fog by the time the express hurtled through the pine woods south of Frankfurt. No one greeted me in the main station, for I had not announced my arrival. This was the way I wanted it. I was no friend of sentimental receptions in public. Not far from the station plaza was my parents' home in a quiet, tree-lined street. As I turned into the familiar avenue, I saw a pair of pretty legs not far ahead. I looked again, then realized they were my sisters. I said but one word. "Trudy?" She spun around and clutched me. Her tears moistened my cheeks. "Why didn't you let us know that you were coming? We would have been at the station. You look good. You have lost weight, though, haven't you?" "I don't think so. It's only because you haven't seen me for a year. Tell me, how is father? How is mother doing?" Trudy tried to tell me all the news in the few minutes it took to reach home. Mother was full of joy. 1 year and 100 imagined deaths lay between us and my last leave. She did not ask about my war. Her interest was aimed at my health and my appetite. "You could have sent us a telegram and I would have a cake for you today." That morning the cake was baked anyhow. I talked to father on the phone. He closed his office for the rest of the day and made the short walk home in a hurry. His welcome was hearty, and we pressed each other's hand like 2 old soldiers. "Hello, son. How long does your leave last this time?" "I am not on leave, father, just passing through on the way to the Baltic. I have no more than 30 hours to spend." "That's unfortunate. Let me see how we can make these few hours most comfortable for you." Then he began asking me questions. How had I earned my decoration? What is a convoy battle really like? How do depth charges affect boat and company? He was eager to hear my view of our progress against the British, and he wanted to know all I could tell him about my patrols. Gradually, our discussion veered to a point that seemed to be of great concern to him. "Don't you think we are spreading our forces rather thinly over the continent? It seems to me we have sufficient manpower to cover the occupied areas." "But how many more fronts can we possibly afford?" he asked cautiously. There was no answer, and the question made me vaguely uneasy. I steered the conversation back to happier subjects. That evening at home and the next were deeply satisfying. Home meant security, an island of rest and intimacy amid the disorder of war. Despite my father's persistent queries, I said little about the U-boats and my feelings in combat. I wished to leave them with the impression that my work was not deadly and tragic, that I would always return. When my train arrived in the capital, icy and violent gusts were blowing in from the northeast. Marianne was at the station, punctual as always. We walked through the almost deserted streets to the plush Hotel Fürstenhof, where I had chosen to stay. The hotel was far better and costlier than the modest accommodations we had to put up with during my last stop, but with my increase in pay I could afford it. And Marianne was different too, somehow less reserved. Her caresses made me forget that there was war, and that I had been in battle all summer and fall. The brutal world ceased to exist in her embrace, and an air raid warning went unheard. During the 2 days of my visit, we rushed from one entertainment to another. To the dismay of the critics, the war had curtailed Berlin's cultural life and lowered the standard of theatrical and operatic performances. Another notable casualty was the quality of the meals offered in restaurants on Kurfürstendamm. No, Berlin was not the same. But my warm Marianne made the cold city beautiful, and I was sorry, perhaps too sorry, to pack up again and kiss her goodbye. The temperature was minus 15 degrees centigrade when I arrived in Königsberg on the last day in November. Shivering in my light uniform, I caught a local train to Pillau, a small port on the Baltic. The compartment was like an icebox, and when I reached my destination, I was almost frozen stiff. It was midnight when I boarded the luxury liner Pretoria, the residence of the 1st U-boat Training Division. At breakfast, there was a grand reunion. I shook hands with many a classmate and celebrated many a Wiedersehen at the bar. We had come from all over Europe. We had fought far-flung battles and sunk a gratifying number of Allied ships. 7 months lay between our graduation party in April and this bitter cold first day in December. For most of us, 7 months of U-boat war had passed without serious injury. This was reason enough to celebrate. Our rigorous training began under severe handicaps. Pillau harbour was covered with ice, in some places up to 30 centimetres thick, and icebreakers worked continually to keep a channel open to minor traffic, giving our U-boats access to the Baltic. We went to sea day and night, with each of us alternately assuming the duties of engineer and captain. Our teachers, experienced commanders, taught us all the new tricks of surface attacks at night and submerged assaults by day. Diving manoeuvres were deliberately fouled up so that we sweated blood to keep the boats afloat. Soon we could perform routine and emergency drills in our sleep. Some of us almost did, for we never had enough rest to recuperate from the harsh exercises of the previous day. But there were also easy days. The commandant of the flotilla, Schuhart, a decorated U-boat ace who had sunk the British aircraft carrier Courageous in 1939, was a superior teacher whose lessons were attended eagerly. The weekends I spent aboard the Pretoria, enjoying a book, playing cards, or discussing Japan's reasons for attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advances in the Philippines and in the Pacific were too far away to be of any great interest to us. I was aware, however, that events in the Pacific would profoundly influence the U-boat war in the Atlantic. With the full involvement of the United States in the hostilities, and particularly in our fight at sea, the outlook for the future changed almost overnight. I prepared myself for a long war. Nonetheless, the battle in the Atlantic still went well, and we had reason to be confident of ultimate victory. Our radio networks sounded frequent fanfares and kept public count of enemy ships sent to the bottom. Almost 3 million gross-weight tons had been sunk in 1941. The British were still unable to counteract our mounting pressure. Entire convoys were virtually abandoned to our wolves. We continued to suffer losses, though. In December, another ace was lost around Gibraltar. Kapitänleutnant Endras and his U-567, destroyers of more than 200,000 tons of enemy shipping, had been sunk without survivors. Our tough training in Pillau went on through January of 1942. Early in February, I was sent to the Naval Academy in Flensburg to attend torpedo school. 6 weeks of classes and practice shooting taught me the latest secrets. Courses in U-boat tactics and radio communication followed as winter slackened its grip. With the arrival of spring, I was promoted to lieutenant while attending gunnery school. As spring came, I eagerly awaited orders to return to combat. Remembering Yvonne with some complacence, I hoped to be sent back to Brest. Admiral U-boats, however, had other plans for Lieutenant Werner. I was instructed to go to Danzig and report aboard U-612 as executive officer. I read the teletype twice before I comprehended. It was indeed a fact that I was to become the first officer second in command, only to the captain aboard a new submarine. The dim prospect of becoming a U-boat commander had suddenly moved within my reach. I arrived in Danzig on May 19th and reported aboard U-612. My boat, new but already weather-beaten, swayed alongside an old stone jetty. A guard told me that the captain was below. I lowered myself into the ship. Its familiar and obnoxious smell was suddenly inspiring. I found the captain in his nook and said, "I beg to report for duty, sir." "Welcome aboard. I am Oberleutnant Siegmann. I have been waiting for you since yesterday. We are ready to clear port. Come over here, please. I wish you to meet the other gentlemen of U-612. The captain, a stocky officer with reddish-blonde hair, had the look of an old seafarer and seemed to be about 7 years my senior. I followed him into the tiny officer's wardroom and was introduced to the chief and the second watch officer. We traded a few pleasantries, and they told me of the boat's history. She had been commissioned in Hamburg, the captain's hometown, in the previous December, and had been in hard training since then. Siegmann expected to finish the mandatory shakedown exercises within 3 months, which would qualify boat and crew for battle. I learned that the previous first officer had been relieved of his post due to poor health. The black-haired chief, Lieutenant Friedrich, was a married man 1 year my senior. Surprisingly, the second watch officer, Lieutenant Riedel, was a classmate of mine. Both men lacked battle experience, and that was the chief reason for my transfer. Although the captain had served as a prospective commander on a U-boat patrol in the Atlantic, only 1/3 of the ship's company had tasted combat. The rest had to be trained for their first mission. I introduced myself to the chief petty officers, who had long service records. Then I retreated with my new captain into his corner, and he gave me a brief but firm idea of what he expected. As executive officer of U-612, I was to be her torpedo and artillery officer. I was to shoot when attacking on surface and to oversee firing when submerged. I was also to attend to the crew's well-being as the captain's deputy. The fact that I was given the exec's position in preference to my classmate, Riedel, was based solely upon my war experience, nothing more. Riedel and I had a frank talk later in the wardroom. We agreed to respect each other's position and to fight the enemy, not each other. The chat initiated a long friendship which ended, as usual, with a death. U-612 sailed that day for the Hela Peninsula. There I made accommodations for the crew in the neat one-story barracks that were spotted among the evergreens in the white sand dunes. U-612 continued her rigid training with 6 weeks of torpedo practice. Day after day we put to sea as early as 7 o'clock, and 1 hour later I was shooting at targets. We changed the routine in the afternoon, and Siegmann emptied the tubes, simulating a submerged attack. Stripped of torpedoes, we raced into port to take on a new load. Then we repeated the entire program in the dark, releasing the last torpedoes around midnight. The crew worked zealously, almost without rest or interruption, 6 days a week. During those 6 weeks, I compiled a sound record. I learned to shoot the torpedoes at the targets and not out to sea. Early in July, we wound up our most taxing exercises. U-612 soon was attached to another division, and an easier routine replaced the feverish activity at Hela. We sailed to a pier in Gottenhafen, a port in the Bay of Danzig, and I moved the crew into solid masonry quarters. Our interests now turned in a different direction. Summer had arrived, and I had not seen a girl for 6 weeks or more. However, women were plentiful only a 20-minute train ride away, in the famous sea resort of Sopot across the bay. I spent the weekends in Sopot's luxurious casino, in the cafes and on the beaches. I arranged and attended parties, won and lost girls, and generally harvested the good life before death could harvest me. While U-612 and her crew were preparing for battle, our armies drove ever deeper into enemy territory. Leningrad had been surrounded, though it still held out stubbornly. Sevastopol in the Crimea had capitulated. Our fast-moving divisions had reached the Caucasus, had occupied Rostov on the Don River, and were storming toward the rich oil fields near Maikop. In North Africa, Rommel had led his Africa Corps to victory after victory over the Tommies. He had taken El Alamein in the Libyan desert and was pushing hard against the Nile. In the Atlantic, our U-boats ravaged Britain's convoys with increasing ferocity, despite the entry of the United States into the war. Our U-boat operations were extended to America's east coast against little or no opposition. From Nantucket to Hatteras, from Florida to the Windward Islands, our torpedoes shattered the silence of peaceful commerce. Between Boston and New York, before Jacksonville, Miami, Havana, New Orleans, and Corpus Christi, near Barranquilla, Maracaibo, and Port of Spain, Barbados and Guadeloupe, U-boats attacked the Allied shipping routes, burned, torpedoed, shelled, and sank a fortune of ships. During those months, some 2.5 million tons over 500 vessels, including 140 tankers, were sent to the bottom. The golden age of U-boat war had arrived. The spirit of our crews in training soared to new heights. I myself, however, was in a state of constant irritation over our long, drawn-out exercises. I wanted to go back to the attack, to sink my own ships, to revive the victory celebrations. But my limited patience was to be put to further tests. The disastrous August 6th almost sank my ambitions. As always, U-612 cleared port by 8 o'clock. The bay was flat and reflected the sun like a mirror. The day promised to be another hot one. Well over 20 U-boats in their light grey paint headed into their designated squares, their wake sparkling in the clear air. The city of Danzig lay on starboard, its many old steeples and towers pointing into an immaculate blue sky. Our navigator, Praga, continuously took bearings from points on land. After 2 hours of small talk, most of us having returned late from our pleasures in Sopot Praga, informed me that we had arrived in our square. The captain was called to the bridge, and we began our daily routine. The seamen, divided into 3 watches, took turns exercising on the heavy gun, while we made simulated diving manoeuvres and surface attacks. At 11 o'clock, U-612 dived. We cruised at 3 knots at a depth of 25 metres. I was in the forward compartment teaching torpedo science to a large part of the crew, plus 12 prospective U-boat men who had been taken aboard to get their first feeling of being submerged. At 11:42, the boat was suddenly struck astern. The force of impact lifted her high up, then flung her to starboard. Instinctively, I knew that we had been hit by another submerged U-boat. I hollered, "Don life preservers, all men into the control room," and ran aft until I was stopped in the diesel compartment by a tremendous water jet. U-612 was sinking. I saw some men trapped in the stern torpedo room and shouted, "Get out of there or you will never get out alive." They hesitated for a moment, then all of them surged through the waterfall. The boat filled fast and tilted down strongly astern. I managed to clear the rear compartments, slammed the doors in the bulkheads watertight, then raced into the control room, closing the round hatch behind me. Meanwhile, Siegmund had ordered the chief to surface. Friedrich kept the lines blowing, allowing compressed air to flow into all buoyancy tanks to hold the boat afloat and permit the men to escape the hull. The captain on the bridge directed his wounded boat toward the coast, 4 endless miles to the south. I ordered life preservers distributed and pushed the guests up the aluminum ladder. For a second I could see the round opening in the tower and the blue sky above. I felt a desperate urge to race up the ladder, but duty condemned me to ride it out below with the chief and probably to die with him. With one eye I watched the swinging depth gauge needle, with the other I watched the men abandon ship. Soon the boat would be too heavy astern and fall away like a rock, taking all of us down to the bottom. I muttered angrily, "Verdammt! In a minute more we could all get out of this coffin." Then I spun around and yelled into the tower, "Get the lid out of your feet! The men behind you have to get out too!" U-612 suddenly slipped away tail first. A cry from the bridge, "Boat sinks! Get the hell out of there!" The last 2 machinists hoisted themselves up the ladder. Friedrich leaped across the valve station and ducked under the extension of the tower, then climbed up the ladder to the hatch. I followed. A sudden heavy influx of water almost tore me off the ladder. I pushed against a ton of water, wedged myself through the opening, and was pulled to safety by the captain. Then the sea swept me off the bridge. At that moment, the bow of U-612 reached far out of the water like the hand of a drowning man. Then the boat sank rapidly. I was shocked by the suddenness of her destruction. As we floated in the Baltic, I realized I was without a life preserver. I had given mine to one of the guests. The water, however, was calm and warm, and only a gentle breeze ruffled the surface. Some distance away, Siegmund's white cap was gleaming in the sunshine. It was still neatly set on his head as he floated comfortably in his yellow life jacket. He was shouting across the water, "Keep close together, boys, they are going to pick us up momentarily." Then he turned toward me and called, "Did you get all the men out, exec?" "There is not a soul aboard. I was the last to leave." Black figures in yellow life jackets were bobbing up and down over a wide area. Beyond, far to the hazy south, I recognized the vague stripe of coast where the Vistula River emptied. Its grey waters were forcing us ever farther out to sea. Knowing the current, I calculated that it would be impossible for us to swim to shore safely. But about 20 minutes later, the bow of a U-boat sliced to the surface. Within seconds, the boat was fully exposed and gaining speed in the direction of the scattered black and yellow spots. The boat that had struck the fatal blow was about to make the second mistake. I stretched out of the water and waved both arms in a frantic attempt to signal her captain to stop the engines. Fortunately, someone aboard understood. The engines were cut off and the boat floated slowly toward us. As she came to a full stop, a second U-boat surfaced nearby and drew cautiously closer. Our men swam to the two metal islands and were hoisted aboard, coughing, puffing and sneezing. Helping hands put blankets around their shoulders. I climbed aboard the ship that had sent ours to the bottom. Siegmund accepted the captain's apology, but his anger mounted as the culprit explained that he had not even realized his boat had hit a submerged object. Our men fell in line on the aft deck for a roll call. I counted 37 heads, including some of our guests who had made an excellent showing. Calculating that 22 men had to be with Friedrich on the other boat, I established contact by lamp and signalled, "Please report your final count." 20 men taken aboard," was the chief's reply. "Does that include you also?" "That does include me," he flashed back. "Please count again. You are supposed to be 22. "Sorry, cannot make it 22 since we are only 20. We were missing 2 men. I was positive I had not left them aboard U-612. Siegmund became ever more furious. "That's just about what we need. Look here, exec, didn't you tell me that you were the last one to leave the boat?" "Yes, I did, and I made damn sure that I got all the boys out. There is not a soul in there." I pointed helplessly at the spot where our boat had been an hour before. But our search revealed no men in the sea, only 2 drifting life jackets. They were the last items we fished from the bay as we sailed homeward aboard the boat that had put us in this miserable predicament. Her navigational fix had been incorrect at the moment of collision. Running submerged, her captain had miscalculated or overlooked the strong current of the discharging Vistula River and had continued blindly on his course without precautionary use of his sound gear or periscope. Human error had thus destroyed 2 lives and a costly submarine. The sinking of U-612 affected our lives profoundly. Just how profoundly became obvious the next morning, when Siegmund held our roll call in the compound yard instead of aboard our boat. We were a highly trained crew with no ship to sail. The captain announced an officers' meeting in his quarters to discuss our uncertain future. Everyone was depressed. We assumed that we would be assigned as a company to a new U-boat, but the process of readying a new boat would set us back many months. Meanwhile, the fattest convoys would be raided by others, and we would be left with the remnants if we were not too late altogether. There had to be a quicker solution. So we explored the possibility of raising U-612 from a depth of 48 metres. The idea of salvaging our boat quickly took on concrete form, and Siegmund submitted his detailed plan to the High Command. 2 days later, we received the answer: raise U-612. Without any delay, we swung into action. I located a diving company with the required experience. Friedrich secured 2 large floating cranes. A tugboat with Friedrich, myself, and a diver aboard left harbour 1 day later. The weather was perfect for our ambitious enterprise. The two cranes arrived the same day over the grave of U-612. Positioning took up the better part of the following day. While Friedrich and I devoted our time to the salvage operation, Siegmann and Riedel took our crewmen to Danzig, where they were billeted aboard an aged passenger ship of the Hamburg-America line. On the 5th day of the operation, the diver finally managed to tie heavy cables around the hull. When the two cranes tried to lift the boat, they almost toppled under the load and the cables snapped. Replacements had to be shipped in from Danzig. The work was in its 7th day when the diver once again secured the steel loops. One of the cranes succeeded in lifting the bow of our boat 1 metre off the bottom. Having eliminated the suction effect, the second crane then heaved the boat's flooded stern out of the sand. That was as far as she could be raised. The two cranes weighed anchor and crept slowly toward Danzig. After travelling 2 days to cover 16 miles, they dragged U-612 through the shallow harbour until her conning tower appeared above surface. Another day was spent patching up the hole in the hull from the outside. On the 12th day, a hose was finally lowered through the tower hatch, and a tug began to pump the oily water out of the boat. The water level sank rapidly, revealing instruments and equipment. After 3 hours, the entire midsection was sucked empty. Curious as I was, I hurried down the aluminum ladder. The control room was a shambles. Fine sand, mixed with black oil and grease and algae, covered all parts. Then I made a crushing discovery. Also flooded was the compartment containing the radio room, the officers' and warrant officers' quarters, as well as the forward batteries. In the excitement of the accident, we had forgotten to close the voice tube leading from the conning tower into the radio room. While the boat lay on the bottom, water had flowed in through the narrow pipe and ruined the entire section. I inspected U-612 fully the next morning, after she had been pumped out completely and towed into dry dock. The hole in the hull was as big as a bucket. The only section that had not been flooded was the forward torpedo room. Its bulkhead had held absolutely tight. The two missing men were not found aboard. An inspection by a commission disclosed that the boat would take from 8 to 12 months to repair. My hope for an early return to the battle was shattered. For 2 days we were kept in suspense. Then headquarters instructed us to commission a new boat, U-230, which was nearing completion in a shipyard in Kiel. The crew was to have an extended leave before we assumed our new duties. The sinking of U-612 with the loss of 2 lives was not our only calamity. During the salvage operation, it was discovered that Messner, our cook, had hoarded a large quantity of coffee, tea and butter. Interrogated by Riedel, Messner confessed that he had sold similar lots on the black market. Crew members said that the cook's dealings had been going on since his arrival aboard. It was inexplicable to me that no one had reported his activity before. In any event, Messner had to be brought to trial. He had a hearing and was convicted. But on the day of sentencing, the cook disappeared. I vainly searched his quarters for a clue to his whereabouts. While I was there, 2 seamen approached with angry faces, claiming Messner had stolen a camera from one and the other's best uniform. A quick check of the officer's luggage revealed that the cook had escaped with the navigator's Luger. Before issuing an alarm, I let 1 day and 1 night pass to give Messner a chance to return. However, he stayed away, and the matter became a case of desertion. Learning that Messner was noted for his collection of women, I assembled a list of addresses where he might have tried to hide. I decided hopefully to apprehend Messner myself and save him a court-martial, which could have cost him several years behind bars. Requisitioning a chauffeur-driven car, I loaded 2 of my men into the rear seats and set out on a private manhunt. I found the first address in a suburb of Danzig, a decent neighbourhood. The girl said that the cook had not been there for weeks. We then drove to a house on the shore road to Sopot. The mother of another fiancé opened the door hesitantly. I was on the right trail, but had come too late. The cook had slept there the previous night, then had disappeared for home, so he had said. Next we raced to Gottenhofen, where another female was known to be awaiting Messner's hand in holy matrimony. I found the girl, but not the fugitive. The last address was a shack surrounded by pines on the Hela Peninsula, a perfect place to hide. The shack proved to be empty. Thoroughly frustrated, we returned to the liner late at night. Early next morning, the fourth day after Messner's desertion, I received a telephone call from the Danzig police saying that a sailor had burglarized a home in a suburb. I was convinced that this was my man. The case was now out of my hands. The cook had gone too far. The same afternoon, I was informed by the Sopot police that a seaman fitting Messner's description had been seen leaving the scene of a robbery in a grocery store. I stayed awake until late that night, expecting further developments, but no new reports came in. 2 days later, the chapter Messner was finally closed. The military police called from Sopot and informed me that Messner had been found lying in a ditch on the road to Danzig. He had tried to take his own life with the Luger, but had succeeded only in blinding himself for life. If I were interested in questioning the suspect, I would find him in the municipal hospital. The captain suggested that I interrogate Messner while he was still in shock. I left at once for Sopot. The day was hot and humid, and storm clouds were thick when I arrived. Lightning flashed across the bay. It was followed by rolling thunder as I entered the hospital. The smell of disinfectants and ether, the silent movements of interns in white, the nurses' wordless understanding of the reason for my coming, the lightning and thunder and sticky humidity. All these made me believe that I myself was embarking on the last leg of life's journey. The nurse guided me upstairs to the cook's room. The window was open and the stiff wind blew the curtains into balloons. The sound of the storm echoed from the walls of the white room. Messner lay in the thin linen like a dead man, stretched out, completely apathetic. He was fully conscious. His blind eyes were bloodshot, his lids swollen. A small white bandage was wrapped around his head, covering a tiny hole in each of his temples. I felt a sinking pity for the man who had the nerve to attempt suicide, but not the courage to stand up for his mistakes. While I was sitting next to him, waiting for him to speak, the raging storm seemed to send lightning and thunder into the room. The booms struck in relentless repetition, as if a convoy battle were being fought out on land. For a long time, Messner remained silent. I saw his useless eyeballs move behind the swollen lids. I saw tears coming through the slits slowly, only a few and very small at first. But then he could not hold back his sorrow any longer, and the mistaken warrior cried. His tears dissolved the man into a boy. Lightning and thunder reached their peak, while the boy in the pillows cried for forgiveness and his mother. I was unable to help the cook, and from now on he would be unable to help himself. Never again would he see the flash of lightning, the clouds accumulate, the rains come down, the sun rise or set. He would never again see his mother or a girl smile at him. When the thunderstorm had moved away, I asked the doctor on duty for a stenographer. She sat down at the foot of the white bed, her pad on her knees, bewildered and shy. Messner could not see her, not her bleached hair nor her beautiful blue eyes. He answered my questions willingly. At the end of my interrogation, he blurted out, "Sir, I am not a criminal. I did not want to steal." "Why then did you have to take all the food and sell it on the black market? Why did you steal your friend's camera, the uniform? Worse, why did you break into the house and the store?" "Sir, you won't believe it, but it's the truth. I wanted to be caught. I thought it was the only way to escape the war. I don't like this war, exec." "What you say doesn't make any sense, Messner," I said, astounded. "Why then did you run away from sentencing? And why did you steal again afterward?" "My buddies are lying, sir. They traded the camera and the uniform for coffee, chocolate and cigarettes. And the food I took in Danzig and Sopot. Believe me, sir, I did it only because I was hungry." "So why did you want to kill yourself? I cannot understand your action, Messner." "I guess I was confused. I didn't want to steal or kill myself. I lost my head. I am finished." "You're right. Nobody can help you now. You better pray for your soul." "Sir, I don't pray, not even now. I don't believe in God. I believe in communism. My father was a communist and he was killed for his belief during the Spartacus Revolution. That's why I condemn this war, exec. It's no good." I looked at him with amazement. I was shocked by this kind of talk and was sure that my man had lost his mind. Since I had enough testimony, I told the girl not to include his last statements and send the typewritten copy to the liner. I did not wish to make Messner's life more miserable than it already was. I closed the window, drew the curtains. I was convinced that the man had indeed lost his senses. Days of activity followed the incident. I wound up my administrative work, and the captain sent the rest of the crew on furlough. We were to meet again in Kiel. By then, summer would be over, and the disaster a thing of the past. Before my departure, tragedy struck again. On September 2nd, a distress call reached land. Late that evening, U-222, on a training mission, had been rammed on surface by another U-boat. With the exception of 3 men, who had been on the bridge at the moment of impact, the entire ship's company had gone down with the boat to the bottom of the Bay of Danzig. When I heard the bad news, it was close to midnight. I boarded the tug that had helped to salvage U-612 and rushed to the spot where U-222 had sunk. Other boats were scanning the black surface with searchlights. Immediate help was out of the question. U-222 lay 93 meters below the surface. The men had to help themselves, provided they were still alive. The crews aboard several U-boats, their sound gears tuned in, listened carefully for a faint sign of life from the sunken boat. All surface vessels near the scene lay with their engines stopped to make the silence complete. The leading rescue ship tried for hours to establish contact with our friends in the tomb. They never answered the calls. I returned to Danzig convinced anew that we must have been under the special protection of the fellow upstairs to have escaped our floating coffin. 4 days later, I became the last member of our crew to bid farewell to extravagant Sopot, where the traditional customs created the illusion of eternal peace. I boarded a train and started a long journey halfway across the continent to the southern border of Germany. I had received the news that Trudy was to be married on the coming weekend, and I planned to make an unannounced appearance. A day later, I arrived in paradise. Lake Constance unfolded beyond the evergreens. Its silvery waters mirrored the white peaks of the Alps, which rose majestically into the azure southern sky. The train halted in Urbalingen, a small medieval town where I had spent many years of my youth. It was so peaceful that I hesitated before stepping off the train. It was as if I would be contaminating the tranquility of the place with my warlike presence. As I walked into town, I recognized the old pine and chestnut trees that had stood there for centuries. I gazed at the ancient houses, the neat flower boxes. I recognized the stores, the people. Everything was as it had been when I left town 7 years before. My sudden return and my promotion to lieutenant caused a commotion for an hour or so. Then all attention focused on the bride. The next day the wedding took place in a small country chapel. The bridegroom gave his greatest performance in uniform. An anti-aircraft gunner who did most of his fighting in the orderly room, he was a safe risk for father and Trudy, and stood a good chance to survive the war. The Blitz wedding did not change my sister's life. 5 days after the ceremony, her husband had to return to duty. My parents departed from the lake, taking Trudy with them. As they left, I gave them my promise to write more often, but I knew, and they knew, that there would not be much letter writing. I lingered on for 2 days more under the Alps and the blue satin sky. The air was rich with the scent of asters, roses, hay, and southern pines. The water was soft and warm, and the swimming was excellent. I walked along the shore promenade, and when I passed the bench beside the old chestnut tree, I remembered sitting there with Marianne and watching a Midsummer Night's fireworks before the war, and it was as if the war had never happened. And when I stood at the old stone quay where I had fed the seagulls after school, I was briefly a boy again. I arrived at the Tirpitz Pier in Kiel late in September of 1942. 1 year and 6 months had gone by since I had departed from the pier for my first war patrol aboard U-557. Things were not exactly the same. The long jetty where the U-boats moored had been screened against air surveillance. As I was told by one of the white-jacketed stewards aboard the old steamer, the Tommies now flew quite frequently over the Bay of Kiel. First, a lone airplane would come by daylight to take photographs of the activities in port. Then a few bombers would come the next night and drop bombs and flares, Christmas trees we called them. I was pleased to hear that our anti-aircraft kept the planes high, and that the attacks had only a harassing effect. but the increased activity caused me no little concern for the safety of U-230. Should our new boat be damaged by a stray bomb, our long delay in reaching the front would be extended indefinitely. One by one, our men came back from furlough. 3 days after my arrival, I mustered the crew on the pier and found them eager to go to sea. But as it turned out, we were far from taking possession of our new boat. Siegmund told us that U-230 would not be ready for another 4 or 5 weeks. We had to accommodate ourselves in an antiquated cruiser, the former Hamburg, which had been stripped to serve as quarters for crews in waiting. Nonetheless, it was gratifying to be back in my daily routine of training and teaching our men. Early in October, I left for the Belgian seacoast to attend a course in electronics. Our boat was to be equipped with radar, which would enable us to locate the enemy at night and even in heavy fog, long before we could spot him with our glasses. The device had been used for years on capital ships and had been instrumental in the sinking of the Hood. Now it would revolutionize U-boat warfare, permitting us to circumvent cordons of escort destroyers and attack targets without seeing them. I returned from radar school excited by the potential of our fine new weapon. Back in Kiel, I was promptly overtaken by my demanding love affair with U-230, overseeing her completion, inspecting special installations, reading technical manuals, and keeping the crew in good trim consumed most of my time. On October 24th, we commissioned U-230, which had just been moved from the shipyard back to the Tirpitz pier. Wearing our best uniforms, we stood in closed ranks on the aft deck, and the commandant of the 5th U-boat flotilla ordered the flag raised. It was the same flag that had flown from the ill-fated U-612, and we believed superstitiously that it would somehow extend the life of our new boat. The ceremony was followed by a rather meagre dinner, which reflected our noticeably shrinking food supply in the 4th year of the war. U-230 was received by her crew with gratitude. She restored to us our status as seamen. Eager to rejoin the great Atlantic battles, we plunged into a long, hard series of drills, tests, shakedown cruises and battle maneuvers. On these short trips, we used our radar at every opportunity, detecting buoys as well as ships. The instrument was not yet perfected, however. Because its sensing apparatus was mounted rigidly in front of the conning tower, it would pick up targets only when they lay ahead of the boat, and when they moved out of the forward section, they disappeared from our oscillograph. Thus, if we wished to scan the horizon, we had to sail in a full circle, a procedure that was time-consuming at best and would be impossible under battle conditions. It was early in November when U-230 left for the shooting grounds in the eastern Baltic. Not far from the spot where we had lost U-612, we released a few dozen torpedoes to check the new firing equipment and polish up our routine. Crash dives and simulated attacks alternated with exercising on the 8.8 centimeters, gun and the new anti-aircraft automatics, with trim and deep dives in exhaustive repetition. The climactic test of this shakedown period was a week-long war at sea. A mock convoy of some 20 cargo ships and several escorts was sent to hide in the northern Baltic, and a Luftwaffe squadron was held in readiness to fly anti-submarine missions. One bitter cold day in December, U-230, along with other U-boats assembled in Pillau harbour, crept through the ice floes and headed north to find and destroy the convoy. As U-230 reached the open sea, a Siberian wind blew frozen spray against her superstructure, coating it with heavy ice. 16 hours later, we located the convoy in the dark and attacked at once. Our assaults continued day and night. The captain tried every attack pattern. I fired my dummy torpedoes from every angle and decimated the convoy many times. Constant air attacks conditioned our watches to stay on guard against death from the sky. The war games ended 5 days before Christmas, when U-230 sailed around Kiel lightship, through the narrow waterway cut by icebreakers, and came to rest at the Tirpitz pier. Boat and crew had performed with high efficiency and were declared fit for her first patrol, but we still had not reached the end of our exasperating delays. Early on the day before Christmas, with the thermometer reading 17 degrees below 0 centigrade, I transferred the boat into the shipyard to be equipped with an extension to her bridge and a second deck for an additional anti-aircraft gun. These and other adjustments were finished on New Year's Eve, and departure on our first patrol was set for January 9th, 1943. But on January 8th, a serious leak was discovered aboard the boat, and our sailing was rescheduled for the following Monday. These last 2 weeks of waiting put a strain on us all. The weather was frigid and blustery, excellent for U-boat operations, but miserable for marking time in our drab, depressing quarters aboard the stripped-down ocean liner. Our meals were poor and skimpy even on Christmas Day, which would have passed without notice but for the parcels from home. We listened eagerly but impatiently to radio broadcasts of our armed forces communiques. It did not help our disposition to learn that Rommel's Africa Corps had suffered a setback at El Alamein and was forced to retreat, or that the Russians and the Russian winter were proving formidable adversaries on the Eastern Front. But the temporary difficulties of our conquering armies were easier to accept than the glowing accounts of U-boat triumphs in which we did not share. According to year-end reports, U-boat attacks had cost the Allies more than 6 million S-tons of shipping in 1942, including at least 500,000 tons each month from July through October, and 117 ships, totaling some 600,000 tons in November alone. The hunger blockade that the U-boats had established around England seemed to be near its ultimate objective. The ghost of starvation and of a lost war was marching across the United Kingdom and knocking at the door of No. 10 Downing Street. The U-boat's phenomenal record had been compiled despite the steady improvement of Allied air surveillance over the crucial defence area between Scotland and Greenland, and also over the Bay of Biscay. The enemy had developed a new kind of radar which permitted bombers to detect a surfaced U-boat even in heavy seas. But to counter this threat, our boats were equipped with an ingenious device, the METOX, that intercepted radar waves, warning us of an imminent attack and giving us time to crash dive before the planes zeroed in on us. Allied air activity had also increased annoyingly overland. Hamburg, Düsseldorf, and other cities were subjected repeatedly to harassing raids. We experienced a minor attack in Kiel, and I went out of my way to get caught in a more serious one in Berlin. After U-230 was found to have sprung a leak on January 8th, Siegmund took the opportunity and left for Hamburg to see his wife and children for the last time before sailing. I decided to use this latest delay to make a quick trip to the capital to see Marianne. We were reunited on Saturday night. It was then that I realized that the solid ribbon of our friendship was stronger than my volatile affairs in port. The bombers appeared while we have having Sunday lunch in the Café Wien on Kurfürstendamm. With the air raid sirens screaming and Marianne tugging my arm, I paid for our unfinished meal and ran for shelter in the nearby U-Bahn station. We were working our way down into the subway through the jostling throngs when the first distant explosions shook the foundation walls. Marianne led me through the crowd, filling the platforms. Women sat on suitcases or on cartons containing their valuables. Others stood in groups holding bags and rucksacks. Old men and women lined the rear walls or rested on small folding chairs. Children played unconcerned, oblivious to the tremors and thunder of bomb hits and the staccato bellowing of anti-aircraft guns. Whatever prompted the British to fly on Sunday and disturb the afternoon strollers and make war on civilians, their raid only strengthened my desire to meet them in open battle at sea. The attack lasted a little over an hour. When we reached the surface, the streets were littered with mortar, glass, bricks and debris. The air was filled with the stench of cordite and smouldering fires. The blue sky was distorted by dirty black and grey clouds rising and falling over the tortured city. Some distance away I heard the bells of fire brigades and the long sighs of police car horns. My train to Kiel was scheduled to leave from Stettiner station at 17:30. But the raiders had destroyed the tracks in a northern suburb. I stood helpless in the rubble of crumbled facades and broken glass from the roof of the station house. U-230 would not be able to leave on patrol because her executive officer had valued love more than duty. I investigated the possibility of boarding a train to Hamburg. That route was still open, and it promised a roundabout way out of the trap. I was told that the train would leave at 20 o'clock, 6 hours late. Farewell was not a heart-rending ceremony. Marianne was a good girl and had long been accustomed to my brief appearances. We promised each other that we would be careful and that we would preserve our love. As the train left the darkened station, I heard the air raid sirens wailing again. At 20:30 the following evening, I finally reached Kiel, and 40 minutes later I knocked at my captain's door. He had heard of the air raid, and before I could make an excuse, he said with relief, "You could have been killed in Berlin. You would have done better staying here." I too was relieved, for it seemed that I was not responsible for delaying our departure. I asked, "When are we sailing, sir?" "A few minor adjustments must be made. It should take another day or so to put our boat in combat order. I want to leave port Wednesday after lunch. I expect you to have boat and crew ready by then."